Well, welcome everyone today. So I'm Ed from Yodel, and we're going to talk about how to get your app on a global scene today. So first, just a bit about me. My name is Ed. For those who don't know me, I've been involved in the growth marketing space for about 7 years now. Actually, funnily enough, started my career in investment banking. Took a U-turn pretty quickly, and then yeah, basically cut my teeth in app marketing agency. I moved to client side for about a few jobs, including Hoop, which is a marketplace for activities for kids. Then moved on to Badoo, more specifically Lumen, which is a dating app for over 50s. Helped scale that for Badoo in around 25 countries. And then my most recent experience before moving back to agency side was with Emma, which is an account aggregator in the UK. And I also happen to DJ as a part-time job. Cool, so let me just introduce you to Yodel for those who don't know. Yodel has around 100 plus years of app marketing experience through our team. We've successfully launched over 500 products globally. We've won the App Growth Team of the Year last year at the same conference, and we have a bunch of other tools in our pocket. Most notably the Mobile Agency Award in 2019 as well. So we're quite versed in launching apps globally. So the way we like to think of our service is like we think of growth marketing as like the intersection of essentially traditional marketing along with product and the commercial aspects as well, because we work with a lot of apps, notably subscription businesses for who like revenue matters more than like just vanity metrics. We work with a variety of clients, as I explained before, from the likes of like giants such as NBC Universal, Trivago, B&Q in the UK, to like more startups, startup apps such as Yolt, Stereo, which was like a competitor to Clubhouse, and My Taxi, which was actually in Germany as well, has now rebranded to Free Now. So let's get cracking. I just make some quick assumptions about what you hear. I guess like either you have an app that's already present in some countries and you want to benchmark against best practices, see what other people are doing, or you just have an app in say one jurisdictions, or you're just launching it and you just want to know how to go about the whole like going global process, like which countries to pick, etc. That's essentially it. So today we'll cover global launch strategies, how to go about like setting the groundwork before you launch. Then localizing specifically your ASO and user acquisition, and then how to embrace a truly sort of global creative strategy and how to feed that back into like all of your launches as you go from one country to another. So let me give you some context. Just looking at what's happened in the last couple of years, most notably like adoption of mobile phones has gone up 33% in the last 5 years, which is quite a huge number. Obviously, this has been more present on developing countries rather than North America or Europe. People have also started spending a lot more time in app. This COVID is part of this, but like this trend has been sustained over the last couple of years. And finally, people are spending a lot more money in app, mostly through in-app purchases, but not only. So that's like a huge market. 150 billion, and which is like projected to grow like over 20% per year for the next 5 years. So this is a huge market. So how do you get a piece of that pie? Essentially, you have to ask yourself a few questions before deciding to enter a new market. The first one would be: is there evidence that there is some significant demand for your product in like a said country? So if you have a food delivery app, you want to be looking at culture in the country. You want to be looking at like are people already using things like this, etc. The second thing you want to think about is like whether there's already some kind of like heavy competition there. So like you might have like if you're a copycat app of like replacing a product and just launching a new market, you might not want to launch in a market where there's already like behemoth apps and stuff like that. And finally, you have to ask yourself also like, is your product, like the features of your product, meaningful to people in that jurisdiction? I'll tell you a fun story about this. Like I used to work for Emma, which is like an account aggregator app, which basically analyzes your spend across like your different credit cards and accounts and so on. And they initially thought like German market would be great because like it's obviously the biggest and like the one that monetizes the best in Europe. And they launched the app in Germany, and it was a massive fail because they only realized a couple of months later that like German people would like to spend in cash. So like basically everyone's spending chart was like 80% cash, and then like you can't get any insights from that. So like huge flop. Uh, Packed up the bags and then basically relaunched in the UK, and that's been like crazy growth story because like people are spending with contactless everywhere. So yeah, it's important to bear in mind those considerations before you sort of go and be like, oh yeah, we want to hit the US market. Have you covered those questions? So let's have a look at like the opportunities. I mean, I mentioned there's been significant growth across territories, but like some of them stand out more than others. I think it's interesting to see that like APAC is like slowing down a little bit in terms of growth, even though it's been crazy the last 10 years. But what's interesting as well is that there's continued growth in North America, which is still the biggest market, but it keep growing at really fast rates. So good to note. The other thing is like you have to think of like your organic versus paid split. Like if you're a gaming company, you're obviously going to be heavily reliant on paid, and so you have to think of like, is the market saturated there? Is there room to push? All of those things. What's quite interesting to see as well is like in North America is pretty much the only market where most of the recent growth comes from organic and not paid, because all those channels are quite saturated. So look at this for your specific case and just sort of use common sense to see like which countries you want to launch. The last question is also obviously how much money people are spending. So in some Asian markets such as Japan and South Korea, people spend crazy amounts on online games and like stuff like that. But it's also good to caveat that like entering Japan, for instance, is like really hard because like they don't use the same social networks as we do. There's like a bunch of considerations there, but like you should look at like average LTV or like revenue per user in the countries be like one of the main metrics to choose where to go essentially. Cool. So how do you sort of navigate through all this information and pick what's most important for your use case? The first thing is to look at your organic data. If you already have an app available in countries and you're thinking of like pushing with some marketing and stuff like that, go to your Play Store console or like to your iTunes Connect, see if there's like any differences geographically. Like maybe people are spending more time in your app in certain countries, so that would be like the first ones that come to mind when it comes to scaling. So just have a look at that. Do users monetize more in certain areas? Do they retain better? Like these are your sort of initial data points that you should consider. After this, you want to also check competition. Like as I mentioned before, like are there any big apps that are doing the same thing as you? Do they have huge market share? Is there space for you essentially? And you can also check like competitor metrics. If you have access to like say an ASO tool like AppTweak or some stuff like that, you want to check like what's their ratings been like for the last couple of years. What volumes of downloads are they getting? Are they monetizing well? Do they have good retention numbers? And you should set those as sort of benchmark to like prepare for your launch and like basically be like we need to beat these guys. And the last piece, obviously the most important arguably would be like how much is it going to cost for you to actually enter that market. So are there any data regarding like cost per install for that market? Can you tell whether people are likely to purchase your subscription product or anything like that? So to benchmark that, consider the obviously cost versus revenue sort of trade-off, and finally just think of like the extra money you're going to have to spend to obviously translate that app into a new market. So that's like translation services for your ASO, for your UA. It's going to be creative production as well. So like if you're like relying heavily, say, on influencers or like video advertising, you're going to obviously have to spend a lot more because like you're going to have to spend the same amount in each market to create those assets as well. So all that has to be taken into consideration. When you have all of that data, you're then going to move into like basically building your own matrix of like what are the pros and cons of each jurisdiction, if you will. So for instance, like you might be like, okay, France is a great country, right? Because it monetizes pretty well, the market's huge, but then it might be that like there's already another app doing really, really well in your category there. So it's like considering all those things together, such as like, do people use mostly Android phones in that market? Is there enough population? I mean, all of those things obviously come together, and I'd say like, essentially build a sort of chart like that, see where there's the most green boxes, and then like that should be your first country essentially. Then how do you forecast? So obviously now you've got like say the initial thoughts as to like which country is coming next. Like maybe we're live in Germany and we think France is the next logical step. So how do you go about like sort of mapping out that growth and deciding launch dates, planning ahead? So I like to usually show this chart, which is what I've used for like countless apps now, to basically scale. Usually clients come to us, with specific targets in mind, like they'll have like top of the line investor information as to how many downloads they need to get this year and how many subscriptions they need, etc. So usually we like to come up with beautiful hockey stick, growth charts. How you do that is basically you just pick all of your countries that are coming next. If you already have one market where you're a heavy hitter, you will know the sort of like attrition level beyond a certain point. So like, say you'll acquire like 500,000 users at like a fixed CPI almost, or like, you keep optimizing. But after you try and hit like certain benchmark, you'll see that costs increase sort of like crazily. So what you want to do is basically get in a situation where you ramp up your advertising or like your organic acquisition even, like sustainably, but until the point where you realize that this market has a fixed size, so like basically say past 500,000 downloads per month, it's going to cost me that much extra per download. So I might want to basically stop there and just use a drip feed. So basically keep spending the same amount of money every month to keep that sort of level of stable growth. But then the extra growth, the exponential growth is going to come from opening new markets. So you want to basically say, okay, France is this big. This will take us like 1 month to, just reach like sort of plateau there. And same for Germany, so then you have to plan your launch like 1 month later, and then say if you're launching the US, this might last you a lot longer to basically grow there. So always good to bear in mind, but basically, yeah, I like to call it plateau and move on, which I guess is, a decent sum up. So now you have this information, you kind of know where you go in, you have a roadmap, you sort of know like when you're going to launch specific countries. You want to have deeper look at like how exactly you're going to do it. So say I'm launching a new app in Germany and this is like a mobile gaming app, for instance. I know I'm going to be heavily reliant on user acquisition. There's not going to be much organic. So the first campaigns I probably want to start is like, just branding, because really like no one knows about you, and scaling. So like because of the stage that you're at, you're going to choose specific channels or campaigns. So say I want to go in and like get 1 million downloads in like a couple of months. There's only a few channels that are going to deliver that. And like everyone's aware of that, I know there's like a lot of different partners here at this event as well, like DSPs, programmatic, etc. But realistically, like your first go-to channels will probably be like Facebook and Google. And then also you want to be aware of like what success looks like. So like which metrics are going to look at. Like in the initial stages, you don't have any data, especially if you're launching a product that's like relatively new or it doesn't have any benchmarks. You want to be looking at like stuff where you can compare yourself with other advertisers. So it'll be stuff like CTR to start with, like okay, are people actually engaging with this ad, and then like are they downloading? But like basically you shouldn't put too much emphasis early on like say registration, subscription, etc. Because they'll come later. Like possibly you just don't have enough data to be able to make educated guesses about your current performance. But then this will come later, obviously, if you're just like at a stage where you've been live in a market, say organically for like a couple of years, you might want to spend more time onto retention. And it might actually be cheaper for you to increase like your revenue by just looking at users that have already used your products rather than trying to acquire new ones at all costs. So the way we like to show this sort of visually is like, like you're gonna have your ASO piece, which is your discoverability. You're gonna have your UA, and you want at every step of the process to basically feed all those considerations in. So at every launch in a new territory, you can basically refine your playbook and be sure that like you come in with the best practices, all the learnings, and then just basically get better at each country that you launch. So I've mentioned this already, but like basically the initial stages are like the research piece, where you use your ASO tools, your organic data, Google Trends, to sort of map out like what's the potential like market look like for your app. Then you do sort of like advanced auditing of like other products, like do you have a proper attribution tool in place? Do you have an analytics solution if you're looking at specific down funnel metrics? All of those things are to be considered before launch, obviously. Then you set your goals. So either your investors decide for you or you just set them yourself. But essentially you'd be like, okay, success looks like 100,000 downloads at the end of month 1, 300,000 at the end of month 2, etc. So just map it out, put it on a Google sheet or something. And then once you launch, obviously you're gonna have to prepare all those assets. So like, your ASO metadata, your screenshots, your ad creative, preparing budgets, and be aware of all that. Then once you've launched, obviously there's going to be a phase of sort of optimization, going into like experimentation. So like, okay, this creative has worked really well. Let's double down on it. Let's use all of our creative budget to make iterations of that because that's the best performance we've ever got. It's often happened, that like in the initial stage of launching a product, you want to try a lot of narratives, a bunch of USPs. Like you test like your product across a variety of audiences, but then you're going to find that one niche that reacts really well, or that one creative that you hadn't thought of that like was crazy. So you need that flexibility to just really rebalance the budget quite quickly and be able to learn. Then obviously that once you have those like few months of launching a new product, you get a better understanding of how it works. You gather some learnings and you sort of review all of those metrics. So you'd be like, okay, like good looks like this conversion rate from like click to download, or like good looks like we can monetize 20% of an audience into like a paying subscriber. And then you take all of those learnings, and then the time that you're launching your new country, you just update your metric, your KPIs a little bit. You just refine that process, and basically it's a constant learning loop of like launching a new country, gathering insights, and then getting better at doing the new one. So what does localization look like in more specifics? So there's a bunch of pieces here. The first one is obviously looking at languages. It's quite complex, especially when it comes with European countries. I mean, there's a lot of languages there. So I mean, that obviously means more resources, more creative production. Typically, a lot of popular apps in like the UK or the US would first go for the English-speaking markets because like there's no translation costs involved. You can just basically roll out across like Australia, Canada, like New Zealand, etc. And also the culture is fairly similar as opposed to other countries, so it's like easier to translate all of your existing assets into something that's going to be worth a lot of money. But yeah, Switzerland, highly do not recommend. And then, so then you look at each of the individual aspects that you need to basically translate. So for ASO, that will be like your metadata, so anything from like your title, subtitle, keyword list for iOS, descriptions, etc. Bear in mind, you can also do some like cool stuff, as into like you can use your story listings from specific countries to rank for others. Like a really popular strategy right now is that apps in the US who are like doing some aggressive ASO, basically like before they launch an app, say in Mexico, that's fully translated in Spanish, they would just publish a store listing in like Spanish America and populate it with a ton of keywords that are basically just the other ones they couldn't fit within the US listing, and that would help them rank. So like there's some smart stuff you can do around like using your listing to basically rank for another, but ultimately you're gonna have to translate all these pieces at one point. And I guess one thing to bear in mind as well is that culture is very important. Like if you whack all of those into like a Google sheet and basically use Google Translate, you're not going to get good results at all. So it's always good to bear in mind, make it double check by someone who actually lives there or speaks the language, be my recommendation. Then screenshots. Screenshots are arguably, not arguably, they are the most important part of ASO. They're what makes people download the app after they've clicked. So it basically is your best lever as to like getting a better conversion rate. And while you can obviously localize, as you can see with the Spotify example, like the titles and like what you're saying in those screenshots, it's important again to bear in mind cultural differences. Like Joe Rogan, for instance, is like super popular in like the US and a bunch of European countries. So like might be displayed on the first thing as like, okay, you can get Joe Rogan's podcast here, but someone in Japan or like South Korea, what might totally not be aware of who that is. There's also differences in terms of like languages. If you're playing, especially in Asian countries, like the characters look quite different. So like you need bigger font sizes and stuff like that. South Korea is also like just a crazy, completely different cultural market. So you might want to adapt to that, do some A/B testing, and you might find out that like one proposition that works really well in a country does not in another. It's always good to bear in mind. Then you need to localize your UA. This is actually the most complicated piece because, say, when I worked for Bumble specifically, and like just launching dating apps, some different markets are at different levels of like what's acceptable from like a cultural point of view. Say, advanced dating markets like the US have like 60% of people meeting through dating apps these days. So you can say things, that, like you can assume stuff that's like already taken in by people. So like We'd be focusing the ads more on like, people meeting at a date or like, someone having a conversation. Whereas like some new countries that we entered, specifically India, was a really interesting one because like there weren't really any dating products out there like 5 years ago. And there's also quite a big friction when it comes to like accepting online dating culturally and like with religions as well. So like we tested our US ads with Indian actors, just replicating that and like making them speak in Indian, but it turned out terribly. Like people just weren't connecting to it, and like there was a huge education piece that was basically required to get people into that mindset of like, okay, I'm going to use a dating app. So be mindful of that as well, especially like when you're using countries that have like the sort of same spending power or like development levels. Like this should not be too much of an issue. But then when it comes to like going from like tier 1 countries to like developing countries, etc., you might have to take a totally different creative strategy. So it's good to basically do the research before you get into this trouble of saying like, okay, we're ready for launch, but actually like our creatives are shit, they're not performing, and now we have to do this all again, which might take like an extra month. That's it. And like I guess all those pieces come together, as we mentioned before during the growth loop. Like you have your creatives for your UA, then people click on it, then they download the app, and then they might take some actions within the app. So what's really important there is that there's this kind of trade-off of like, maybe your creative is going to convert super well. People are going to click on it, they're amazed by it, but then they come to the App Store and like you're telling a different story. Or maybe in your creatives you've been testing like 5 different propositions, but you only have 3 screenshots, on your App Store listing that show up like to most people. So you have to make sure that the message is basically the same, or like you can keep people entertained and converting at each stage of the funnel. So basically this looks like this. It's like you've got your CTR, you got your install rate, and then if you're targeting specific down funnel events like a subscription app, or like you're trying to sell in-app purchases to gamers or anything like that, you might want to consider all of these when coming up with creatives. It's quite important because like we've done stuff, like where like vanity metrics are basically shit. It's like you look at your creatives, you've got like crazy high CTR for one ad at the start, and be like, okay, cool, pull all the budget on it, And then you're driving traffic to your app, and those people are downloading like crazy. Like you've got £1 CPI there compared to £5 there. But then if your business objective is actually to gather revenue, and if you look, obviously with iOS 15 it's getting a bit more complicated, but like you do have directional data about this. And so if your ultimate goal for like, I don't know, your OKR or whatever is to basically drive a shitload of subscriptions, you're going to have to go about it a different way. You're going to have to mention prices even in your ads, which might completely drop your CTR, but those people that actually get to the store and download the app will be like much higher quality users. So you have to consider all those pieces basically. Like you never take like a win as like a pure win, like if you see one creative being like, wow, crazy, like no, look at the full funnel before you can make that decision and just change your strategy. So I guess this is about it. Yeah. So I guess if I could summarize it in like a quick way, identify your opportunities, look at the data, just be like sensible about it. Look at the cost, like what's your budget, how much money do you have for the coming year, etc. Prioritize and forecast, so like country 1, country 2, country 3, and then go through the whole tedious process of just like getting all those assets ready, so like ahead of time, so you can really launch with maximum power. But essentially, I sum it up as this, is like, I mean, I don't know if there's crypto people in the room, but this is a popular acronym apparently. Do your own research, basically, or just contact us, and we've got a whole team, some of which are here, that can help you with that. All right, thank you very much.